Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Karen Self with Tetra Tech. I help develop our processes and procedures that we use to support our clients in administering the emergency rental assistance programs. And I work with our ERA project managers to provide assistance and guidance daily as we continue to manage these programs throughout the country. Just a little bit of background about our programs. Tetra Tech is currently working with about 12 clients throughout the United States, one state and several counties and cities to assist with their disbursement. And so far today, we're very proud. We have disbursed over $500 million in ERA assistance to about 80,000 households. We have a great team that has helped us to do that. So we also provide program services related to other federal programs like the Homeowners Assistance Fund that a lot of states are just starting to kick off. We're also working with the Child Care Stabilization Program out of the ARPA grant. And we also do some CDBG, Community Development Block Grant, disaster recovery, program assistance, and FEMA, federal assistance, their public assistance program. So we work on all different kinds of grant programs, and the ERA program was brand new to us this year, and lots of lessons learned that we're going to talk about today. We do have quite a large crowd. Folks from cities, counties, state agencies are joining us today. Local and state level departments, all kinds of different communities represented on our webinar today. We're going to start this afternoon's webinar with a panel of our experts in the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. They will be addressing questions that we've received, some frequently asked questions from some of the folks that we know, and some questions that you all have sent in to us to discuss during our presentation today. And they'll be ranging from federal policy and advocacy to the actual nuts and bolts of operating these programs, right? It takes a lot of staff, it takes technology, it takes checklists and all kinds of SOPs and things like that. So we'll be covering all those aspects of the ERA program today. After about a half hour of moderated panel discussion, we'll take questions from the audience. You can type your questions into the chat and anytime during the webinar, and we have two facilitators that are watching the chat to make sure that we answer all of your questions. So let's get started by learning a little bit about each of our panelists. First up is Jennifer Schwartz. Jennifer is the Director of Tax and Housing Advocacy for the National Council of State Housing Agencies. NCSHA is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that many of you are very familiar with. I know that we look to NCSHA for guidance on ERA as well as Homeowners Assistance Fund and other programs. Jennifer leads NCSHA's multifamily and tax policy team and oversees their federal legislative advocacy efforts. Thank you, Jennifer, for being here today. And also on our panel, we have David Walker. David is an accountant with Charleston County Community Development, one of South Carolina's top programs for proportion of award disbursement in the ERA program. So he's been working with the county's ERA program since its first allocation, and he brings a financial perspective to our panel today, in addition to general program processes and procedures. David oversees various aspects of the county's ERA program, including staff, processing application, payments to landlords, all that good stuff. Thank you, David, for being here. And also on our panel is our own Wesley Sapp. He's part of the Tetra Tech ERA program. He's currently overseeing the ERA program for Leon County, Florida. which dispersed 100% of its ERA1 allocation in the first 100 days of program launch. Leon County is the top Florida program and the 8th in the nation as far as proportion of award dispersed. So that team has just been chugging along. Wes is also Tetra Tech's project manager for the City of Philadelphia ERA program, and brings perspective on practices and lesson learned from both of those communities. So thank you all panelists for being here. We'll go ahead and get started with the first round of questions. Jennifer, this one's going to go to you. We have this question a lot from a lot of different communities that we work with, especially with a program that's brand new to virtually every award recipient. From your perspective, what are some of the characteristics that make a successful ERA program? What do they share? What's a commonality among successful ERA programs?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to Tetra Tech for having me here today. I really appreciate the invitation, and it's always good to talk to people about the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. I've been working on this program since its outset, really even before its outset, because I was involved in lobbying for the resources that went into this on the front end, and then of course on the implementation side with the state agencies. And I have to say that, from my perspective, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, I mean, here we are, we're almost a year out from when the initial bill was passed to authorize that, which was the 2021 Consolidated Appropriations Act, the first $25 billion. And I think the program generally has been a really phenomenal success, considering the fact that that grantees of all different sizes had to stand up this brand new program, create the infrastructure, and do all that it's taken to get to where we are right now. Again, less than a year in, and most of the money at this point, Treasury is expecting 80% of ERA1 money to have been spent by the end of this year. So that's really significant. As far as characteristics of successful programs, I think, none of this is going to sound like rocket science, but having an application process that is as uncomplicated as possible is really important. Treasury has taken some steps along the way that many of these things are things that NCSHA had been asking Treasury for a while, but they've done a lot to make their own guidance less complicated and allow for a more streamlined application process. And so I think grantees should really try and take advantage of the flexibilities that Treasury has now allowed in the process. The other thing I would say is that your partnerships are really key. So first of all, partnering with landlords, not just individual landlords, but also with landlord organizations. So the National Apartment Association or the Multifamily Housing Association, or those sorts of groups are really critical, because they're the ones who are going to be trusted figures to the landlords, and the landlords are a really important partner for this program in order for it to be successful. Another really important partner are state courts. So having connections with your courts so that they understand that this program exists, and that you can make sure that eviction filings, you can meet people where they are using those partnerships with the courts, and then other community leaders as well. So for example, a lot of rural states that have larger tribal populations have really done a lot of outreach work to tribal leaders. And that, I think, is really important, because we need to, reach people. And some people you're going to be able to reach with, social media or television advertisements or radio and all of that. And in some cases, you're really going to need to get to community leaders to do that. The last thing I would say is transparency. Having a system where someone can look up their case and see where they are is really important, because otherwise you're going to have people who are, confused about where they are in the process, frustrated about that. You want them to be able to see, kind of what the steps are and understand that. And you want to be able to explain that to policymakers as well. So I'll stop with that, but those are some of the key things that I see.
That's great. That's great. And I also want to just touch on a little bit further on one of the aspects that you were talking about, which is the application. David, I'm going to punt this question to you. What are some strategies that grantees can use to make sure they get really good application data up front from applicants?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for having me as well. Looks like it froze up on me a little bit, but so one of the key things that is to have a application processing software that lists specific requirements of the program. That's pivotal to a successful program. On our end, we also have a great internal support staff who understands the requirements of the program, and they receive regular updates, which allows for continuity. Quick response times we found are very important. So that's not only from us responding to questions that applicants have, but also getting a quick response from them as well. So we found that actually picking up the phone and calling the applicants is it's a little more, works a little more effectively sometimes, especially with certain applicants versus sending an email.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to that point on that responsiveness, I know there's always a little bit of back and forth with applicants in any type of program where you're doing intake. Wes, in the programs that you've been running, what is the best way to communicate when you've got a group of applicants that have gone sort of dormant or not communicating anymore? What are some ways that you can kind of get some of that information from them in a timely manner?
Yeah, no, Karen, thank you for the question and appreciate the opportunity to be on. And obviously, thank you to Jennifer and David for joining us for, I think, an ever present and important conversation to have around rental assistance. I think, for us, right, I mean, a goal for, our implementation of these programs is really to meet the applicants where they are, right? That I understand that Outlook is the best, medium of communication for me. I've got the app on my phone. I probably email Karen far too late into the evening, right? Because it's the most convenient way for me to, communicate back and forth with my colleagues. And so I think, challenging yourselves to think sort of outside of the box in terms of how you communicate. We've implemented SMS communication, right? Understanding that, somebody might have a 15-minute break throughout the day and see a text on their phone and be able to respond, being able to have JPEG capabilities in that SMS campaign, right? Obviously hardening it to make sure that there's security placements or security considerations in place. But being able to engage through SMS, right, where you can have a one-on-one conversation is just as effective, right, as email, but may be more convenient for the applicant to be more responsive to you. Having outbound phone capabilities is another really good strategy to get a hold of someone or to track someone down. Both for landlords and applicants, right? I think challenging yourselves to think of as many different opportunities to meet an applicant, right? That fits your community, that fits their lifestyle, a method of communication that meets them where they are. Really helped us to get a better response time, and ultimately, right, allowed us to keep administrative costs low because we're getting applications through the system faster. We're getting landlords paid faster, right? Which allowed them to be more engaged with the program because they saw the results happening really fast, and then ultimately allowed us to be able to have a complete application file really early in the process by using a combination of email, text, and phone calls.
Thanks, Wes. That back and forth communication brings me to our next topic, which is information coming from the Treasury on what's happening with reallocation. This seems to be on the minds of all of our clients and our colleagues. What is the latest and greatest information coming from U.S. Treasury on a potential reallocation of funds? So, Jennifer, I'm going to pose this question to you. What is the most current information that we have from U.S. Treasury and their plan for redistributing ERA funds?
So I think what everyone needs to first understand is that the formula that Congress put in place to distribute ERA1 funds the first time around was based entirely on population. So it didn't take into consideration things like the cost of rental housing, how fast rents are increasing. It didn't take into consideration the population of renters in a given state or jurisdiction. It didn't take into consideration the arrears that were owed in different areas. And I think that that has really come to fruition. And what we've seen is that some grantees got far more resources than their demand probably warranted, and other grantees got far less than what they needed. And so this reallocation process that we're going through right now is really an opportunity to, quote unquote, right size these grants. Now, I say that on the front end, but really, I don't think there's going to be a lot of money that is going to be reallocated because in most jurisdictions, demand has been huge for this program. And so we are seeing a lot of grantees that have run through not just their ERA1 money, but they're also, some of them are even done with their ERA2 money. So it becomes more and more important that we try and move money around to the places where it is needed the most. Treasury has set up a process for this. So they put out guidance last month on how they were going to go about reallocation. It is going to happen gradually, and we're already in the middle of this process. So basically every 2 months, Treasury does an assessment on their grantees, and they set a minimum expenditure ratio or a percentage. And then they look at, are you above or below that minimum percentage? So for September 30th, that percentage was 30%. It goes up by 10% essentially every 2 months. So November 30th, it was 40%. In January, at the end of January, it will be 50% and so on. This goes through until the end of March, at which point Treasury technically could recapture any funds that haven't been obligated at that point. We know that there are some grantees who got more funding than they really needed that are voluntarily giving back funding. And those grantees can do that in one of two ways. And Treasury actually last week put out a template for how to do this. The grantees can either volunteer to give back funds in excess of whatever that minimum expenditure ratio is. That's the mandatory give back. But a grantee could say, you know what, I want to give back more money right now because I know I'm not going to go through this, and I know that it's better for me to give that money back and have it redistributed to other grantees. They can either go just through the general process, or if there is another grantee in their state that they would like to reallocate a portion of their funding to, and that grantee is eligible to receive that funding, then they can specify that who they want the funds to go to within the state. That being said, I think there are probably a lot more grantees that are looking for money than grantees that are looking to give it up. And so the way that requests work, grantees have to get their request into Treasury. I think they had to have their request in for the first assessment as of November 30th, but don't worry, if you want to request funds and you haven't sent that in yet, you can still do that. It would just be applied to the second assessment and so on. And so that whole process has really gotten started. Treasury has not put out yet the reallocated money. I think they're really still trying to figure out, well, how much money do we have to distribute, and how much of it is going to go in-state versus out of state. The prioritization process, first of all, their first priority is to reallocate funds to other in-state grantees. And after that, it would be to grantees that have exhausted both ERA1 and ERA2. And then whatever's left would go out via need to grantees that have requested additional funds. In order to request additional funds, grantees just had to have obligated at least 65% of their ERA1 funds by September 30th. So that's where things stand right now on reallocation.
Great. Jennifer, thank you. I know this is a lot of clients of ours and a lot of grantees have been asking about this because they did get through their ERA 1 and their ERA 2. We have a lot of communities that right now are going into that, and they're anxious to see if there's going to be a reallocation from, or when that's going to happen. I know we get a lot of questions about it. I also want to make sure I remind our attendees that at any time you can post a question in the chat and we will kick it to our expert panelists here. So feel free to just type right into the chat, and we'll pass the information along. To Jennifer's point, Wes, what do you think grantees can do now to be prepared for a potential ERA 1 reallocation?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it really boils down to 3 easy things that you can implement right now to prepare for reallocation. One is to make sure that your program is in a posture to be administered under ERA 1 rules, right? I think that everything has been at such a fast pace that, as you rolled from ERA 1 into ERA 2, you may have shifted some eligibility, maximum months of assistance. Your application may have changed, right? Because we know that Treasury, worked their hardest to, make sure that ERA 2 provided a more streamlined way of moving funding into communities. And so going back and making sure that if you have a pool of applicants in your software system or in your portal that you plan on using these reallocated ERA 1 funds for, just making sure that the guidelines that you use to bring those applications in through the application, through your review eligibility criteria, that they align with the requirements that exist under ERA 1, and that you don't errantly maybe have attributed ERA 2 rules to them and you're paying them out of ERA 1 funds. That's probably number one. The second one is to identify any stopgap funding that exists that would allow you to either continue processing, right, and be able to maybe backfill with ERA 1 dollars as they flow into your community, allow you to keep staffing on board so that you don't have an awkward pause in between the end of maybe administering the money that you have and the reallocated funding that we anticipate coming down the road would be the second one. And then the third one would maybe consider doing another analysis of your community. As Jennifer mentioned, right, there's a lot of things that have changed since December of 2020 when the bill passed. And for many of us, when, a lot of things have changed since we began administering these programs. And so I think, being able to do another analysis of your community and make sure that the resource allocation that you intend on having for those ERA 1 reallocated dollars meets the need of your community, right? And as I said earlier, meets the folks where they are. And so maybe it's, as she mentioned earlier, maybe it's a greater relationship with your local courts. Maybe it is a greater emphasis on utilities or a greater emphasis on rent because of these rising rent costs. Doing that analysis, I think, will help drive the ability to get those reallocated ERA 1 dollars out of the door fast and make sure that you're getting the most need met in your state or community.
Great, thank you, Wes. Jennifer, curious to know, has NCSHA made any recommendations to the U.S. Treasury regarding the ERA programs, or is there collaboration going on there between the two entities?
We've made many recommendations over the months, some of which have been implemented by Treasury and others not. All of our materials and letter requests are available on our website. We have a specific web page that's dedicated to ERA. We were the ones who asked for greater clarity around self-attestation, for example, which resulted at last in the August 25th rewrite of the frequently asked questions. Also around bulk payments to utility providers and landlords. But we've asked for clarity over a number of different things or requested policy changes in a number of areas, over time. So, with a good degree of success, but not as much as I would have liked. Obviously, I want them to do everything we ask for. Most recently, we've been involved on trying to get Treasury to make some changes around reporting, though. And this is an area where I feel that the reporting guidelines that Treasury has put out are extremely complex, and many grantees need technical assistance. Treasury also has some technical problems with its portal, that a number of grantees have faced problems with uploading materials or making changes to things if a mistake was made, pencils that are grayed out, that sort of thing. So our most recent request to Treasury in regards to reporting is, first of all, to limit quarterly reporting to those criteria that are required by the statute, and to have grantees provide at the end of the ERA1 program, so after September 30th of 2022, a much more detailed report, but not have that happen on a quarter-by-quarter basis, especially because we know that sometimes expenditures are made and then certain funds are recouped or sent back, and maybe that crosses over from one quarter to the next. It becomes very confusing. We'd rather have something that is a point in time cumulative for the program at the end of the program. And also we need to clarify some of the issues around things like who's a subrecipient, is a landlord that receives over $30,000 a subrecipient, those sorts of things. So we think there's some technical assistance that's needed on reporting. We think that additional time is needed. So we have asked Treasury to provide a blanket extension at least, so that it can really streamline its requirements and make changes and fixes to its portal before requiring grantees to really report things. Because from what I've heard, the data that has gone out to Treasury in the quarterly reports so far has a lot of things that are missing, and I'm not sure it's going to be all that useful for anyone.
I can't see everybody's head, but I would imagine they're all nodding right now because we've heard that same thing echoed. It even came up today in an email that I saw about November's reporting, and because of the having to go back and fix some data and what that means. So we appreciate having that line of communication with Treasury to be able to make those recommendations. I'm going to switch gears a little bit to talk about administering ERA1 and ERA2. David, we get this question a lot on because some of our communities have been able to administer all of their ERA1 and 2 money, and there's still need. So have you found alternative funding sources that can be used to supplement the ERA program, or alternative resources that can supplement the ERA program?
Yeah, so the county received COVID relief funding through HUD prior to the ERA funding, and we've spent down most of that prior to the ERA program starting as well, but we still had some subrecipients that had ESG, CV, homelessness prevention funding. And what that can do is it allowed for additional incentives for landlords, for example, like paying 3 months, up to 3 months total as like an incentive, almost bonus at the start of like the move-in statement for an individual to make it more desirable for a landlord to rent to somebody with an eviction history or bad credit, those sorts of things that would not normally allow an individual or family to get an apartment at a complex, because most of the larger complex have set requirements. And we found that the ESG CV funding has helped in limited circumstances, but that's just the example that we have.
That's great. And we've found that there are programs where they're just pulling resources from wherever you can in order to make this work. Alleviating certain requirements and things like that is helpful as well. Wes, have you had grantees use other grant programs as a stopgap, or have you had any of those discussions about using another grant program to bridge the gap between ERA2 and a potential reallocation?
Yeah, so obviously that's something that's front of mind, and it has been mind-boggling, as I'm sure Jennifer can attest to, right? I mean, there's so many different funding sources that have come online over the last year, or well over a year. And so the one that we've used, right, and with some of our grantees that we've worked with is the state local fiscal recovery fund. And so, mainly because, right, rental assistance is explicitly made an eligible expense in FAQ 2.5. And so that's been used as a stopgap maneuver to, if somebody ran over 10% of their administrative costs in ERA1, obviously that was bumped up in ERA2, but that can sort of backfill some of those administrative cost needs for grantees that are experiencing shortfalls on the administrative cost side. It can also be used for programmatic dollars, right? If you are wanting to find a way to continue processing applications while you wait for your ERA1 reallocation, you can use those funds in that capacity and backfill it with those ERA1 reallocated funds, or continue to process applications as normal. And then also, being able to use the state and local recovery fiscal recovery fund, right? I mean, the projects you're using in your communities for that or in your state are offsetting general revenue, right? There's oftentimes line items that addressed the programs that you're going to use that fund for, and the general revenue that's freed up can then be used in various ways, that allow you to continue funding your and processing your ERA program.
We've heard a lot of. I think Wes might be having some technical problems, but yes, we've heard of communities looking into using their ARPA state local fiscal recovery funds as a stopgap, and there are a lot of different grant programs that are coming online, and being able to have that flexibility is really important. Also want to talk about, from a policy and procedure perspective, Jennifer, what were the biggest differences, or what are the biggest differences between administering ERA1 and ERA2?
Yeah, so I think we think of these programs typically as a single program, but really we've got two different programs with a lot of similarities. What it seems to me that people are most interested in getting to ERA2 because it is more flexible generally. And one of the ways that ERA2 is more flexible than ERA1 has to do with the eligibility requirements. So for ERA1, households either needed to have a member who was on unemployment, or the household had to have had a member who had suffered a COVID-related hardship. So a hardship that was due directly or indirectly to COVID. For ERA2, a very important word was added into the statute, and that is during. So any hardship that happened during COVID, even if it didn't have to do with COVID itself, would qualify a household for that particular eligibility criteria. And that was a huge difference in the program. Obviously, there are some other major differences, like the fact that with ERA2, 15% of the funds can be used for administrative costs versus ERA1, which is only 10%. And what I'm told is that ERA generally is a very expensive program to administer. Many grantees had to bring on vendors to help them with processing applications. Obviously, all the vendors that they had to bring on to build these portal systems, so the technology vendors, and just really had to increase their staff capacity. There is a lot of direct contact for ERA between the grantee and the landlord and the tenant, getting data from both individuals. That takes a lot of manpower. And so having the 15% on ERA2, I think, is really important. Another thing that's different about ERA1 versus ERA2 is the timeline for the program. So for ERA1, the program is wrapped up as of September 30th of 2022. So, which, actually, that is still 9 months away, over 9 months away, but it's going to be coming at us pretty quickly. technically ERA 2. Now, personally, I think the money is going to be long spent way before this deadline, but it is, it goes out until September 30th of 2025. And so, that just goes to show that it was really, Congress was thinking about it as more of a long-term program. The thing is, the demand has been, so high, the need is so great. So those are some of the main differences in the programs. And the last thing I would say about ERA 2 is that there is this kind of golden nugget that most people had hoped to get to, but probably won't because the money will be spent. And that is if grantees had spent 75% of their ERA 2 funds as of next October, technically the last 25% they could work with Treasury on broader activities. So beyond just the rental assistance and utility needs. And I know that there were a lot of state grantees that had been thinking about, well, what could we do with this extra 25% if we're able to get there and spend that 75% and balance everything exactly correctly to get there? And would Treasury allow us to use some of this funds for things like capital costs associated with supply? Because what I hear from a lot of my members is that there's a need for rental assistance, but part of the problem is that there aren't affordable homes for people to rent to begin with. And the supply issue is key. And obviously I work on that all the time with other programs, but anything that we can do to increase supply is always going to be really important.
Lots of very interesting nuggets in that in that response. Couldn't agree with you more about the documentation differences between saying an economic hardship because of COVID-19 versus during COVID-19, and how just that one change to open things up and allowed for a much more frictionless application process, because that documentation was so hard for applicants to produce. And so in a meaningful way. So that was a pretty big game changer between ERA 1 and ERA 2. And it's interesting that you bring up that 25%, because we do have communities that are, say they've gone through their ERA 1 money and their ERA 2 money, and they're holding on to that 25% to find out what they can do with it. So because there are more issues than just rental arrears in affordable housing. So very, very interesting. Thank you, Jennifer. David, how did Charleston County adjust its workflows in order to accommodate ERA 2? Were there big changes that had to be made, or did you just switch around some checklists? Like, how did you achieve that?
So because we successfully implemented our ERA 1 funding so quickly, we didn't make any significant changes to our workflow or our processes for ERA 2. One of the most significant things was having the economic impact occurring during COVID. So that helped a lot for ERA 2 versus what the requirement for ERA 1. But other than that, we have staff that has all been cross-trained on all the workflows. So that way, if somebody can step in if somebody else isn't able to complete the work.
That is the staff training and that cross training and being able to backfill is so important. It became very critical, especially during this pandemic. We would have staff that would be out because of COVID-19 protocols, and so we would constantly be having to backfill and make sure that we've got coverage. And so that cross training was so important. And then cross training between ERA 1 and ERA 2. Making sure that staff really understood the difference of how to assess case files with ERA 2 versus ERA 1. And then the applicants themselves too, providing that information so that they can submit the right documentation. One of our last questions before we start picking up some questions from the audience that we've received, it has to do with telling our story, or telling describing to the community the ERA program and what's been achieved. I constantly see, newspaper articles and podcasts about the ERA, about the ERA program, and living in it for almost the last year. I always wish that there was another narrative out there. So, to just explain how difficult it is to move billions of dollars in a very short amount of time. But Jennifer, how important is it to do that outreach and local media and connecting with political leadership to describe the successes of these programs?
So it is very important to be doing the communications work on this program. And I think, everybody has been so busy trying to just, run the program, do what they're supposed to do and what their jobs are. Their jobs are not necessarily to have, contact with their local media or, to do that kind of outreach to local elected officials. But that's really important. And what we've seen with this program is that, the narrative kind of got hijacked by people who don't understand what it takes to administer a program and thought that, if Congress appropriated funds, that somebody could flick a switch and this program should have been up and running and serving people, by, the mid-February. And that's just not, it's not practical. It's not realistic whatsoever. But I think that, there had been, especially with the eviction moratorium at the national level through the Centers for Disease Control going into effect so many months before ERA 1 was even authorized, before we knew that we would have this funding, there was a huge rush for people because people were in need, both on the, certainly on the tenant side, and then also the landlords who hadn't been paid. And that made it really difficult. And it made it something where, with grantees opening up their programs in April or May, people thought, hey, this money had been, authorized back in December, and, not thinking about, well, what does it take to stand up a program? You've got to wait for, guidance from Treasury. We had a change of administration in the middle of it. You need to figure out how you're going to implement this program. You've got to talk to your technology providers and make sure that they understand that what it is you're trying to do so that they can build a system that works for that. And all of that does take time. But the other thing is that we need to be talking about what we're accomplishing here and, how many people we're serving, because there's always going to be someone who didn't get served fast enough. And that's always going to be a problem. But we need to be able to go out and do press releases and talk about, the success of this program, because we are helping hundreds of thousands of families stay in their homes and, have moved an incredible amount of money to do so with people who have been working around the clock at so many of these grantees, doing a phenomenal job and putting in their all at a time when, everybody is under an intense amount of stress. So I think it's really important to be, showing the success of this program. We want Congress to be able to say, hey, this was a good idea and this really helped address our problem. We wanted to prevent people from losing their homes. We wanted to prevent, make it so that landlords could pay their bills, so that tenants would be safe in their homes, and we did it. And that's the outcome that we want to get to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know I keep a file of emails that we get from recipients saying, thank you so much. This has helped beyond belief. And we really appreciate this assistance. A lot of recipients who have never needed help before. And because of COVID, they are in dire straits. And it's just astonishing that when you are able to get this out to the community, what an impact it has on, helping people stay in their homes. So couldn't agree more on telling the positive story that this has had in a lot of people's lives. Now I want to just kind of open it up a little bit. We've got a few minutes before we close. We did get a few questions from our audience. So a couple of questions from the city of Greensboro. And this first one has to do more with the reporting requirements. I know, I think it was like right before Halloween, we got this new this new guidance right before the quarterly reports were due, and it caused some hiccups. There was a lot of questions about what a subrecipient is and things like that. So we do get a lot of questions about the Treasury reporting because it is critical. Everybody who runs a grant program knows that the thing that matters most is your data management. And so we got this question. Can you confirm that no matter what type of assistance provided, whether it's rental assistance, utility assistance, or both, it counts as 1 month of total assistance? So I know, Wes, you and I kind of chatted about this. I don't know if you want to take a stab at this to sort of explain how this is documented.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. I won't ask anyone on the call to raise your hand if you asked for the extension to the end of November, because I think it's safe to say that there are probably a lot of grantees who exercise that option with some of those later reporting guidance that came from Treasury. I think specifically to this question, it was a good question, right? It's one that I know that a lot of grantees have grappled with over the course of administering ERAP. The way that we've always approached it, right, is by looking at it by the month rather than the type of assistance, right? So if in January a recipient received utilities, and then in February they received both rent and utilities, right, that would be 2 months of assistance instead of 3. So you look at it by the month rather than by the assistance type, right? And the FAQs sort of, there is some gap in terms of it being that explicit. But when you look at it by the month, right, and by strictly by the letter of the guidance, that is how we've always interpreted it and sort of shepherded our clients through that situation of how to navigate. When you have multiple funding, and even going into ERA2, you've got internet assistance that you can provide. And so, when you've got 3 pots of assistance that you're providing in a single month, right, if you're taking it at the intent of the program, you're right, it would be that 1 month of assistance, regardless of the types of assistance that you're receiving in that particular month.
Okay, thanks, Wes. Anything to add to that?
Do you think it would be helpful if Treasury would specify that? Because I know that there are grantees that have interpreted that differently. I tend to agree with you that go with the more conservative way of doing it, but not everybody has done it that way, and it is not clear from the guidance that they're wrong.
Very true, very true. And it's interesting, when we were training our staff to calculate how much assistance to provide and looking at arrears, and there are different interpretations of how you can apply the partial payments. We got into this conundrum about partial payments for utilities and things like that, and so we had to come up with a consistent process that everybody was on board with, and there's room for interpretation and assessing those amounts and things like that. So our second question has to do with compliance measures, and David, I'm gonna put you on the spot, see if you've got if you can add to this, but what compliance measures do you have in place, and what percentage of cases are being reviewed if service is carried out by a subrecipient? So first we'll start with the compliance measures for Charleston County.
So we have a consultant that helps us process applications, but on the county side, we review every single application anyway. So like I mentioned earlier, we have internal staff as well, and everybody's cross-trained. So we all know the process, whether it's reviewing the application for eligibility or also processing the payments to the landlord, which within the software it's all in one piece, but they're almost separate in a way. So Compliance wise, we ensure that we're maintaining in our policies and procedure manual that is in line with FAQs and any guidance that Treasury puts out, and basically just following along those lines.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I think one of the we manage a lot of different grant programs, and we start out with 100% review, QA/QC review of all files, and then depending on what our clients want, we continue that 100% review, or you can drop it down to once you get a rhythm going and you're finding very few, like less than 5% or 3% errors, then you can, do a percentage of a review file. But it just depends on, whatever it is, whatever your process is. Treasury has definitely made it clear that it just has to be captured in your policies and procedures manual. So that is a critical piece of this program. I know when we were first looking at the ERA program and we were building our first policy and procedure manual, we went line by line to make sure that everything we had was either derived directly from the law or explicit in the FAQs. And this program hasn't been around for years and years and years, and it's brand new. And so there were some gray areas that were left up to interpretation. And so anywhere where we found that we had to make a decision that wasn't explicitly outlined in the Treasury's guidance, we notated it in our policy and procedure manual. And then anytime there was a change to that, a key decision was made. Okay, we're gonna reverse course on this because maybe another FAQ came out. Everything was documented in that policy and procedure manual and timestamped so that we could go back and say, this group met, we talked about it, and we decided we're going to take this course of action, and how important that was months later to be able to describe, why we made the decisions we did. So, well, I think we'll kind of open it up again, just to the panelists. We do get some questions about fact-specific proxy data. I'll kick this over to Jennifer. Do you know of any clients who are using like zip code data or anything like that in order to process their applications?
There definitely are some that had been using fact-specific proxies, although once the August 25th FAQ rewrite came out, that became a lot less important because you really could just accept self-attestation without having to collect all of those documents first. So, fact-specific proxy was always a mechanism for getting around having to do so much documentation. And, I think that it has been relied on a lot less since we got the much more flexible guidance that came out a little bit later. Some of the states I know that had looked at and had implemented fact-specific proxy, Kentucky, Virginia, Texas, a number of states had, but the new guidance made that even more easy to deal with.
Absolutely. I know we have a lot of clients that are winding down their ERA2 programs and, well, even with their ERA1 programs, now starting to manage appeals. David, do you have any, lessons learned on the appeals process, or what are some strategies that grantees can implement in order to manage any appeals that they might get?
Sure. Yeah. So we have a multi-level appeal process with the final appeal at the deputy county administrator level. Many of the appeals we see, though, are denials for non-responsiveness. So it's essentially going into the software if the application was denied for non-responsiveness, reopening the application and letting the applicant know what that was needed to start with, and that when they were originally requested for it. Other we see is applicants outside the county. So there's nothing we can do other than refer them to the area that they live in, because we do border 2 other counties that we get a lot of, at least in the beginning, we got a lot of applications for those 2 counties. but it was either they had to apply to the state or that county directly. Each appeal, if it's for a process or for a reason other than what I just mentioned, we contact the applicant directly, and the process is documented in our software as well. So if they were denied for being over income, there's not a lot that can be done there, other than I will say a caveat to that is if they were over income because of their 2020 tax returns and their current income situation is different, meaning they don't have any income or they dramatically lost income, we've been able to follow an appeal process too, where some of those cases have been able to be processed. So.
I think we might have lost that last bit of audio at the end. We're coming up to our 1 hour mark, so I just want to go around the room with the panelists to provide any final thoughts. I'll start. Wes, any final thoughts to close out with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Jennifer really hit it on the head as it comes to building a successful ERA program, right? Having a hardened process flow that can adapt to ever-changing guidance and reporting requirements, having an application that's streamlined and easy to understand allows the applicant side of the program to run really quickly, but also establishing really good relationships in your community and being as proactive as you can, right? And we all know that we're operating under guidance and a statute, but the more ownership that landlords and community leaders can feel that they have over the program has really driven a lot of productivity from the grantees we've had a privilege of working with. And just to thank Jennifer again, the folks at NCSHA have been tireless advocates for every grantee across the country. They've made themselves available day and night to answer questions and are working both publicly and behind the scenes to advocate on the behalf of all the grantees around the country to make sure that we get the reporting requirements that are streamlined. And she's continuing even today to ask if hey, would this addition make sense for if Treasury were just able to make that quick little change. So we certainly appreciate you so much, Jennifer, and the work that you all do day in and day out to make this program work for both the Americans that desperately need the assistance and the grantees that are working tirelessly to administer it.
Thanks, Wes. Jennifer, I'll hand it off to you. Any final thoughts as we close out?
Oh, first of all, thank you, Wesley. That was very nice. Nice of you, kind of you to say. I think, my main closeout is just that, I really give a hand to the grantees who I think have just done a phenomenal job and have risen to something that really was quite a challenge and, really saved lives over the last year.
Thank you, Jennifer. David, any closeout thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much would like to echo everything Jennifer and Wes said, but I just kind of want to reiterate more. The partnerships are key, so whether it's the application processing, either, consultant, contractor helping with that, the software on our level, like the various county departments have been tremendously helpful. Like one example is the libraries. Like they have helped out tremendously in helping individuals complete the application. So that's a very important aspect that I think that would be for any grantee of this funding.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all to our panelists for providing insight and tips and information to our attendees. And thank you, attendees, for staying on with us for this hour. We really appreciate it. We hope this was informative. And that's the end of our program. Thank you all so much. Have a great day.